While on parole for a violent sex crime, Coburn BROWN, born on May 16, 1958, carjacked 21-year-old Holly Washa in the parking lot of a hotel, and demanded at knife point that she drive or die. He later forced her into the passenger seat, tied her hands behind her back, and drove her to his motel nearby. In his motel room, Brown forced Holly to remove her clothing, then tied her to the bed and raped and tortured her repeatedly for the course of several hours. Eventually, Brown put Holly in the trunk of her car, slit her throat, stabbed her repeatedly, and left her to bleed to death in a parking lot. Several days later, Holly's body was found in the trunk of her car. After stabbing Holly, Brown then flew to Palm Springs, California, to meet with his next victim in another hotel room. He handcuffed her and slit her throat, but she survived and incredibly was able to call the police when Brown left the room. Brown was arrested in the hotel parking lot and quickly gave audio-taped confessions to both the rape and attempted murder of Susan in California, and the rape and murder of Holly Washa in Washington. Holly Washa had left Ogallala 3 years before her murder, believing Seattle was a prime spot to pursue a career as a flight attendant. She found part-time work as a dispatcher at a Seattle cable television company and at a Hickory Farms store in South Center Mall. Washa left tiny Ogallala, Nebraska because she wanted to be a flight attendant. Washa left Ogallala in February 1988 to attend a 3-month course at the International Air Academy in Vancouver, Washington. 3 months later, she moved to Seattle. She worked part-time as a dispatcher at TCI Cablevision, and 2 weeks before her murder began a second job in a Hickory Farms store in South Center Mall. After the kidnapping and murder of Holly Washa, Coburn BROWN then flew to California, where he was arrested for trying to rape and kill a woman. While being questioned by Palm Springs police, Brown told them they could find Washa's body in the trunk of her Oldsmobile in the parking lot of a SeaTac car rental agency. Brown had been released from Oregon State Penitentiary just 2 months earlier despite the protests of a prosecutor who had helped convict him in 1984 for assaulting a woman. In 1984, Coburn BROWN was sentenced as a dangerous offender for his attempted assault on a 24-year-old woman in Corvallis, Oregon. Brown, a freshman at Oregon State University at the time, had been introduced to the woman by her babysitter. Brown appeared at the woman's home wearing a hat and carrying a backpack. He persuaded her to let him rest what he claimed was a sprained leg. When she turned her head to call him a cab, Brown flung a 43-inch leather thong over her head to choke her, but the thong caught on her lip. The victim recalled the thong instantly tightening, and she was yanked off her feet backwards. She landed on her stomach 6 feet away with the thong still around her neck and Brown kneeling behind her. She rolled to her side and saw him wild-eyed staring into her face. He held her, and she screamed, and a police officer who happened to be nearby arrested him. Police found a large knife and a roll of 2-inch wide duct tape in his backpack. The woman's 2 small sons were home during the attack. At the time, Brown already had an extensive criminal record, including a 1977 conviction in California that involved a knife assault on a woman in a shopping center. Brown served the minimum 7.5-year sentence for the Oregon attempted assault conviction and was released on parole from the Oregon State Penitentiary on March 25, 1991, after receiving a favorable psychiatric evaluation. Upon Brown's release, he was placed under the supervision of a parole office who specialized in the supervision of sex offenders. The parole officer was given a letter from the district attorney who had prosecuted Brown on the dangerous offender case. In the letter, The DA stated that not only did he consider Brown to be one of the most dangerous criminals whom he had ever prosecuted, but also that unless he has undergone a remarkable transformation in prison, he will remain a potential mutilator and killer of women. During the first 2 months of his parole, Brown had enrolled as a student at Oregon State University and had met with his parole officer. Towards the end of that period, the parole officer could not get in touch with Coburn BROWN and on May 23, 1991, requested that an arrest warrant be filed on Brown. On the very same day, Brown carjacked Holly Washa in the parking lot of a hotel near the Seattle-Tacoma airport and demanded at knife point that she drive or die. He later forced her into the passenger seat, tied her hands behind her back, and drove her to his motel nearby. In his motel room, Brown forced Holly to remove her clothing, then tied her to the bed and raped and tortured Holly repeatedly for the course of several hours. The next day, Brown forced Holly to call in sick at her job at TCI Cablevision. He again tied Holly to the bed, gagged her and sexually assaulted her with foreign objects, including a bottle. He whipped her and shocked her with an electrical cord. Eventually, Brown put Holly Washa in the trunk of her car, slit her throat, stabbed her repeatedly and left her to bleed to death in a parking lot. After pleading guilty in California and receiving a sentence of life imprisonment, Coburn BROWN was tried in Washington. A jury convicted Brown of aggravated first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. Brown was convicted of aggravated first-degree murder for the 1991 stabbing and strangulation death of 21-year-old Holly Washa. The aggravating circumstances were that the murder was committed to conceal the identity of the person committing the crime, and in the course of or furtherance of kidnapping in the first degree, rape in the first degree, and robbery in the first degree. In 2007, when the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear an appeal from Brown, Holly's family expressed their frustration. In 2005, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned Brown's death sentence, but it was reinstated by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2007. Brown had a prior execution date in March 2009 but received a stay. September 9, 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court denied Brown's motion asking the court to hear his appeal challenging Washington's lethal injection protocols. Brown filed a motion requesting a stay of his execution in U.S. District Court, Western Washington, in Seattle. His motion before District Court Judge John C. Coffener argues that absent his medication, he would be incompetent to be executed. This motion, while similar to the motion before the state Supreme Court, is unrelated. The Washington State Supreme Court denied Brown's motion requesting a stay of his scheduled execution, and arguing that absent his medication, he would be incompetent to be executed. Brown had argued that his mental illness was not adequately considered during his sentencing and that it should bar his execution. According to court records, he suffered from bipolar disorder. Judge Coffener rejected Brown's motion for a stay. Brown appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals denied his motion for a stay. Brown appealed the earlier decision by the Washington State Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court, who did not respond by midnight. September 10, 2010, Brown was put to death by lethal injection. His time of death was 12:56 a.m. In all the years he has been on death row, he has shown little remorse for his crimes. His last meal was pizza, apple pie, and root beer. And in his last words, in a lengthy statement, Coburn BROWN did not apologize to Washa's family, but said he understood their enmity for him. He said he forgave that hatred and hoped the execution would give them closure. He also said the prison staff had been most professional and that he had no complaints about his treatment there. However, Brown protested sentencing disparities, saying criminals who had killed many more people, such as Green River killer Gary Ridgway, were serving life sentences while he was put to death. I only killed one victim. I cannot really see that there is true justice. Hopefully, sometime in the future that gets straightened out. Brown's final words were "Thank you, God bless you, God bless my family." After his comments, Brown, who was lying on his back strapped to a gurney, looked up at the tube sticking out of the wall and connected to his body. When the drug was administered, his chest heaved 3 times and his lips shuddered. Then there was no movement. Brown's attorney and members of his family were not present at the execution, though he spoke with them by phone. The father, brother and 2 sisters of his victim, Holly Washa, witnessed the execution. Cal Coburn Brown was the 38th murderer executed in U.S. in 2010, the 1,226th murderer executed in U.S. since 1976, and the first murderer executed in Washington in 2010, the 5th murderer executed in Washington since 1976. Thank you for watching Death Row.